Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I wish to talk a little bit about systematics, and in particular one big problem I think there exists with systematics. So this video is called Square Pegs, and obviously it's a reference to the fitting a square peg in a round hole type of situation. And hopefully you can already see where this is going, but in case you're not, let's begin. So first of all, let's ask this question, why do we even produce systematics of any sort, like scientific systematics or philosophical or any sort of applied type of systematics? Well, an obvious response would be the three words you've probably heard many times on this channel, and these words are will to power, right? So it seems to be the answer to any sort of question of this sort. That's another tautology as usual. So why will to power? How does systematics helps in any way in this respect? Well, obviously we wish to spread our influence on the world. We wish to organize the world because organized world helps us spread our influence more efficiently, right? Therefore, so we want to make the world navigatable, habitable, if you wish, right? Again, organized, mapped, so that we would be able to see right away where everything is, where we can apply, let's say, our strength and influence the world in any major way, etc., etc. So spread our influence, spread our power, increase our influence and our power, right? So systematics helps in these respects because where previously we've had like a bunch of unknown, like a huge lump of darkness and chaos, we would receive after we've performed any sort of systematization, we would perceive something ordered and really well understood and easily manipulable. You know, easily, something that we can easily apply our influence to, something like that, right? Hopefully it's understandable. And here comes the main point of this video, like any systematics comes with its inherent problem, and the problem is that, again, fitting a square peg in a round hole, that when you produce a systematic, you inevitably damage the material. So, and that's sort of like a half of this problem, really, but it's an important half, right? Well, maybe not a half, but let's say a part. One aspect of this problem, this general problem of fitting a square peg into the round hole, right? So first of all, like the peg is square and the hole is round, so what the hell are you doing in the first place? And secondly, if you try to fit it in, you would damage either the hole or the peg, or most likely the both, right? So this is what I'm talking about. So a metaphor for this, like systematization and inherent damage it brings, could be made with like paving the ground, right? So you put like some stones or concrete or cement or whatever the heck you call it onto the ground, and therefore you kind of disrupt the ground, right? So what you receive as an output is, it's a very nice and flat surface that is very understandable to you as a human being, and you can traverse it easily and go wherever you wish. So it's very good in this respect, right? But inherently it does some damage, right, to the ground itself. So and occasionally maybe you get some like cracks in this surface of yours, in this pavement, and maybe some occasional weed is gonna grow through it, etc., etc. So basically what I'm trying to say with this metaphor is that any system is inherently flawed by virtue of being a system, all right? Something like that. Not just because we cannot build a perfect system, but because the very fact that we can even build a system in the first place is a flaw in a way, you know, because life is inherently overwhelming. It's like overflowing, like over the top, you know, sort of. Yeah, kind of like this weed that grows through your pavement anyway, like however well you have established it, etc. So again, metaphorically speaking, when you light a fire, and like producing any sort of systematic might be, again, metaphorically described as a lighting a fire, you know, so that you can see better. But whenever you light a fire, you produce shadows, right? And like the brighter the fire is, the starker the shadows are, if that's a word in English. Like the sharper, I guess, would be a better word. So yeah, something like that. So you produce these outliers, right? But we'll talk about this in a minute. And something would escape your eye because you produce these shadows anyway, right? So fire is comforting and useful, and indeed you can see stuff in it. I mean, in its light, reflected light, and it can probably allow you to do other stuff like cook your food or make you warm. But at the same time, yeah, it produces various artifacts like that. And here's a more like general, more abstract thought of the same quality, let's say. So it's already difficult enough, and in my previous videos, especially about like philosophy of science, I've covered it at least partly, but I wish to emphasize it is already difficult enough to, well, for example, in mythology as cultural basis, I talked about how we construct objects, and in more recent video, hyperreality, I've also talked about this, right? Again, I'll link all of them in the description as usual. So it's already difficult enough to construct a reliable object. By the way, okay, well, I have to reference it. Stories of Medicine is where I specifically talk about these outliers with regards to medicine, like how objects are constructed in medicine and how medicine is narratively structured itself. Okay, I'll link this as well. So it's like the 6th or 7th attempt I'm trying to start this sentence. It's already difficult enough to construct a reliable object that wouldn't fall apart, etc., etc. But when we're constructing a systematic, we're actually doing something much more profound and much more difficult in a way, like orders of magnitude more difficult, actually. So what we're doing, we're not just constructing an object like an isolated entity. What we're doing is we're actually implying that there's like sort of like behind the scenes connection between different objects, right? That, well, by virtue of being them being a part of this systematic. So they are somehow logically, if you wish, connected through some sort of true world behind the real world, you know. I don't know what kind of example I can bring. Probably I wouldn't bring any, but hopefully you can see the idea, right? The systematic implies inherent, like some sort of very deep connection between various objects, the ones that we systematize over, right? So, and this statement that there is such a connection is a much more profound statement than this object exists, which again, as I've said, is already hard enough to make. So yeah, so this is, it's a long shot, you know. So there's that. And this is basically the main point of this video, or at least like one other aspect of it. Okay, so, and from here, and by the way, Nietzsche said the same thing, and I completely agree. So he more or less said that I'm very suspicious of all the like hyper systematic type of philosophers, you know, and I completely agree. So the more systematic a philosophy is, basically, the more suspicious it should look, by all means, I would say. And again, I have to reiterate this sort of contradiction I keep talking about between order and chaos, right? Some people say that basically out of order comes chaos. This is roughly speaking religious thinking or like metaphysical thinking. And some people say from out of chaos comes order. This is sort of more a bottom-up type of approach, right? And I'm more of a fan of the second one, but it's regardless. Systematics is more of a from order comes chaos, right? From like inherent ordering of things emerge into our world, and through some like divine intuition we can grasp this inherent connection between these objects, right? This is what like an giga omega optimistic version of any sort of systematization looks like, right? Or sounds like. So any sort of like idealistic philosophy is heavily baned, if that's a verb, like is heavily influenced by this I don't know, type of thinking, pattern of thinking, sort of. And there are many examples of like thinkers who utilize this sort of approach. Like this name wouldn't tell you much, but again, Sergei Pereslegin, the Russian philosopher, whom I've mentioned a few times in my videos, like he is definitely one of these guys. Like he constantly brings up like huge tables with like super deep multi-layered systematization of everything, and in particular like very profound, very deep philosophical ideas, and it always looks so wrong to me. I don't know, like it looks absolutely artificial. It looks like it doesn't have anything to do with reality at all. So yeah, that's at least my stance towards this sentiment, let's say. Then we can look at German, so-called German classical philosophy, which is also heavily contaminated by systematics, and there are many jokes about this, etc. So, among other things, why are these sort of systematizations suspicious? Is again, well, firstly, there is an inherent flaw of any systematics, but besides that, there is obviously a more localized problems which are often, which arise often in many of the attempts at systematization of various stuff, and these include, but are not limited to, various phantom contradictions that people sometimes make. And what do I mean by that is like basically sort of like artificial contradiction that these people themselves who make this systematic think exist, but in reality they kind of don't, you know, and things like that, like arbitrary criteria for systematization, right? Also like based on personal experience of any sort or something like that. And again, in general, like personal idiosyncrasies. And here, like, unfortunately, I don't remember the exact quote, nor do I even remember the author, nor do I even remember who this quote was about, but it was about one of the German classical philosophers, like either Fichte or Schelling, I think. And the guy who sort of criticized them, it could have been Schopenhauer, but I'm not sure it was Schopenhauer. It may have been somebody else. So they said about, again, either Fichte or Schelling, that this guy thinks that whatever he learned until age 16, he believes that this is like some profound truth about the world, like his experiences before the age 16. So it's kind of already understood that the philosophers themselves understand that this is kind of a garbage. Like when a person tries to build like a complete philosophy of everything, right? It basically boils down to your personal experience, and it's kind of worthless mostly, right? Like, you may like have a couple of good ideas, but probably the rest of your ultra giga mega system is garbage, right? So yeah, so it's probably better to even abandon these attempts in the first place. All right. And another source of like influences is obviously the culture. So again, the person doesn't live in a vacuum. They're learning some language. They're learning some like customs. They have some habits of thinking and of like what's the word? Well, they basically take on or borrow, let's say, other people's way of thinking about things, and these people also exist in a culture, right? So the culture is a big deal in this sense. I mean, we kind of take for granted that philosophy is like a product of Western civilization, let's say, roughly speaking, and it exists inside of it, but we don't really reflect on that fact, at least not too often, unfortunately. But culture definitely impacts your philosophy a lot, as well as your personal experiences, just as I've mentioned already. Okay. Then there's obviously a lot of other flaws of this sort and of other sorts, like the method that you use for your systematization, like the criteria, influences the systematization. I mean, its outcome basically dictates it, right? And as I've mentioned with this proverbial weed that grows through the pavement, in any way, however good your systematics is, there's going to be outliers and exceptions always. Just, again, by virtue of life itself being so overwhelming. And by life, I mean like the world around us, basically, right? Not the natural phenomenon of life, even though it's obviously also part of the universe. So, in this way or another, we'll have to deal with some sort of miscellaneous, or whatever the heck it's pronounced, miscellaneous type of stuff, like uncategorized type of stuff, anomalies, outliers, etc. And it can be also, again, one example is Lakatosh, Imre Lakatosh's description of evolution of scientific ideas, where he says that, well, we start with a simple idea, again, which probably produces some sort of simple system of its own. But then, as we try to apply it here and there, outliers appear, right? We can see, okay, we cannot describe this thing with our simple idea. Therefore, we need to add another idea, at least, to help us cope with it, to help us describe it. Basically, we need to patch our theory, if you know what I mean, in software kind of sense. And as we progress more and more, and as we try to apply this theory more and more to various other things, we need to increase the number of patches, because inevitably the theory wouldn't work here and there in this way or another. So yeah, and this is what he calls belt of protective theories or hypotheses or ideas, which again appears when the theory cannot handle this much new data and keeps producing outliers, right? So yeah, so this is one example, and again, like the general point is that life precedes systematics, not vice versa, right? So the universe doesn't care what do you think about it and how you systematize it, right? There is a very good example, and I wish to make it, example of a really good systematics which worked really well, at least historically. And well, to a degree, it's still very useful, to a large degree. And this is Mendeleev's table, the periodic table of elements, or yeah, I think that's what it's called in English. So just as I've said, like, why do we need to systematize stuff? Well, to navigate it, right? To like make a map, and the table of elements is a perfect map of this sort, right? And it also obviously helped us to discover new elements, which is again one of the most incredible feats of this sort of this thing of the table. But I would say it's rather an exception than a rule in the whole realm of systematization. Like, it's a really profound example of how it can work when it works really well, but it does so rarely that again it's rather an exception than a rule. But again, we need to give credit where it is due. Here it is definitely. So I have to mention this. But anyway, also connected to that, a comment is that if your systematic is at least a little bit connected to reality, like if you're not just taking it out of the blue, like just completely make it up just for memes or something, then again, if you even use this crappy systematics of yours for navigation, and you say, okay, we have this thing with this property and that property, we have this thing with this property and another property, but we don't observe the third thing where it should be a thing with this property and a third property, let's say. But we haven't observed this thing yet. And then you can try to sort of simulate what kind of thing it could be, and then you can try and go and try to find it actually in the universe. And so even with this crappy systematic, you actually got some directions, if you know what I mean, like some navigation. And you can probably find it if you look good enough. Because again, as I've said, like, life is rich enough. So if you look hard enough, you'll most likely find almost anything, right? So even this mysterious new thing that your systematic seems to imply existing, you may probably even find it, right? So in this sense, systematization is a good tool of direction, or arguably misdirection sometimes. So yeah, there's that as well, right? Okay. I mean, maybe the technology is not there to find this thing. Maybe something else is missing, etc., etc. You know what I mean? So it's not guaranteed that you will find it. Maybe somebody else 1,000 years later will find it, when everybody would forget about you and your systematic in the first place. But whatever. Hopefully it's all understood. So, other interesting example of what happens with systematics is constant redefinition of stuff in biological taxonomy, for example, like how we subdivide living beings into various realms, various like taxons and stuff, kingdoms, etc. So there are constant debates of this sort, and then like the borders keep shifting back and forth, and the amount of kingdoms keep like increasing or decreasing, or whatever else comes into play. So it's all pretty interesting to observe. But again, here we're actually dealing with not just life, but the life, and it's also, like, as I've said, it's overwhelming. It's constantly like changing and trying out stuff, and everything, like all kinds of crap is happening. So it's no wonder that it's very hard to classify, right? To put into a table of some sort. Okay. Then even like obvious and well-defined things such as species in biology, for example, just as one example, they are kind of poorly defined, right? Like species is like something that can reproduce, and the progeny, the children would also be able to reproduce, right? But then again, we know that certain species can reproduce together, I mean different members of different species, and produce hybrids, right? And some of the hybrids are also fertile, like for example female ligers. You know, in case you don't know, like liger is like a child, a cub of a male lion and a female tigress, right? A female tiger. So female ligers are fertile for some reason, even though like they shouldn't be or something. So the definition of species is kind of badly constructed, I would say, at the moment. Then of course we have all the thingies connected to human species. I mean, Homo sapiens is considered to be a species. But then again, the question is so politicized that I wouldn't speak about it here. Okay, and well, we're kind of moving closer to the end, hopefully. So one other thing I wanted to talk about, well, I'll probably just briefly mention it, is like, what is the motivation? Because sometimes you can see those systems, again, it's kind of very apparent in philosophy, and like some neighboring areas of study, let's say. And it looks like people are creating systems just because they can, almost, you know, like out of the blue. Again, it's mostly about philosophers and like mathematicians, maybe partly, even though this, like, sometimes it is justified, at least much more justified than in philosophy. So I almost have a feeling that it is indeed this academic culture which actually produces this sentiment, like, oh, let's make a system just because we can, why not, right? So this academic medium of like filled with textbooks and like bookworms and like hundreds of hours of grinding of some useless stuff, you know, university courses, etc. It kind of brings forth this sentiment, right? Like the university, basically, it's one of its main tasks as a governmental institution, or at least an institution tightly connected to the government, is to upbring an obedient citizen, right? And how do you do that? Well, you put a person through again these hundreds and thousands of hours of grinding of useless stuff, so they can show you that, okay, I am ready to work hard and do this absolutely useless crap, just at least so you would know that I'm ready to obey and do all this stuff, right? And I think like one of the sub-products of this culture is again this systematization of everything, and people like being hyper optimistic about science because, again, well, there's probably a million of other textbooks that I haven't grinded yet, and they seem to be like, you know, correct and solid, and everything is actually like, if only I had like 2 more lives to study it all, then I would know the secrets of the universe, because the smarter people have already uncovered them and put them in these books and whatever, right? So this is the sort of an unhealthy, actually, sentiment that the universities bring into life. Not even talking about like the modern universities per se. I'm just talking about like the university, the idea of it, if you wish, right? Like the modern universities have much more problems on top of that, let's say. Okay. Well, probably one last thing I want to mention is, can we get rid of systematics, or should we get rid of systematics if they are inherently flawed, just as I mentioned initially? And here I can say that recently there have appeared various alternative approaches, let's say, to knowledge, to science, and it's not guaranteed that they're all good. It's not guaranteed that they will remain, let's say in a few decades even, let alone like 100 years. But still, there are attempts at like doing something differently, at least. Well, one of these such attempts is so-called post-theory knowledge, right? So we can say that a theory is essentially a product of systematization also, right, in the first place. So again, we bring forth a couple of statements and we systematize objects in the world according to these statements. And that's what a theory is, basically, right? But in post-theory type of approach, we don't even make any claims of this sort, right? We just sort of grasping at straws in a way. We're like trying to describe what we can describe however we can describe it, right? Basically, we like derive an empirical formula and say, we have no idea what these numbers mean, but they seem to work, right? Something like that. So that's one sort of approach, I guess. And I haven't done it too much, what's the proper word? Not service. Well, I described it a little bit worse than it is in reality, let's put it that way. But something like that, okay? Then one interesting approach of other sort is frequently used in like social sciences in the last, I don't know. It's actually already kind of obsolete, I feel. But I'm not a specialist in social sciences, so I can't really judge on that. But so-called case studies, right? They were popular like 20 years ago or about so. Maybe 30 to 20, something like that, but not sure about now. I guess they're still popular to a degree. So case study is when you actually take a problem, like a chunk of the real world. Again, it's mostly in social sciences. So let's say a problem of homelessness in Jakarta or whatever. So you take this problem and then you start like lighting it up from various directions with different interpretations and different like aspects of it, right? Like we can study it from the point of view of demographics and statistics, from the point of view of politics, from the point of view of religion, from the point of view of culture, from the point of view of theology, why not? From the point of view of linguistics, of economics, of you get the idea, right? And each one of these interpretations kind of highlights one aspect of your problem, but then you kind of accumulate it all and like bring all of the, you can even treat this from like a psychoanalytical perspective or Marxist perspective or like a perspective of social sciences of behaviorists or whatever, right? So there are all these possible interpretations of a certain problem, and you kind of use them all and you kind of accumulate it into a big text and like here is this problem studied from different angles, right? So this is what is called case study. And sometimes like pretty deep insights can be found in these types of studies that can even be generalized sometimes. And I kind of feel that modern astrophysical studies are actually similar to that. Like when people, let's say, study a comet like 67P, Churyumov or Gerasimenko, for example, like they also like bring forth like, you know, data from different instruments, data from ground observations, data from models, data from models, you know, all these things, and they combine them together to get some sort of a three-dimensional picture, sort of, you know, of what is happening. So, yeah. So I feel like it's actually an underrated way of viewing our current studies of let's say again, astrophysical objects is like a complete analogy with case studies in social sciences. It's really, really very similar, I think, at least. Okay. Yeah. I think that will be all. So let's conclude this rant. So here we talked about systematics. I talked about that the motivation for systematics is will to power, because we wish to project our power into the world, and a systematized world is a much better place to project your power into rather than a completely chaotic world, right? But unfortunately, every systematics comes with a price, is that you damage the material you're trying to systematize, hence the metaphor of square pegs fitting them into the round holes. And any system is flawed because life inherently is overwhelming. It cannot be stopped, limited by certain frame. And the thing I talked about, how making a systematic is a much more difficult task than just constructing an object, because you're not only constructing an object, you're actually constructing a very deep connection between many objects, right? Which, like, it's a much stronger statement to make, and it's a, if you indeed find a legit systematic that works, an example of a periodic table of the elements, chemical elements, and it's just an amazing discovery. But again, as I've said, it's more of an exception than a rule, the periodic table, right? And therefore, since every systematic is inherently flawed, the more systematic a philosophy is, the more suspicious it should be. And there's all kinds of aberrations possible, but in this way or another, like, any systematics would necessarily produce a bunch of, like, misfits, so to speak, a bunch of outliers and anomalies and things like that, like exceptions, because again, life precedes systematics, not vice versa. Then, as one example, I brought biological systematics. I tried to figure out where this comes from, this sentiment of let's systematize everything, aside from, you know, basic motivation of will to power. And I think it's this academic culture of grind, you know, which is really unhealthy and kind of brings forth, again, returning to what I've said, how your culture kind of predetermines the way you interact with the world, right? Well, among other things. So academic culture is definitely involved in this as well, in this particular instance of this, which is making systems, right? And then we've ended with talking about the possible future, how systems can be maybe surpassed, maybe exchanged for something else, and I gave you only 2 examples of so-called post-theory knowledge and so-called case studies. Okay. Yeah, I guess that would be all. There are 2 Patreon exclusive videos on Patreon. Who could have thought? At the moment they are very short, they're like 5 and 8 minutes long or something like that, but I would probably keep them exclusive to Patreon, at least for now, maybe for a few months at this moment. But there is already like 2 other videos there. Actually, like this one and the previous one is still on only on Patreon. Well, if you're watching this on YouTube, obviously it's already not on Patreon. But there are 2 more longer videos on Patreon pretty much anytime, okay? So, because there's a 2-week delay of when I'm making them public on YouTube. And there are exclusive videos as well. Maybe it's actually more than 2 at this moment if you're watching this on YouTube, because this is going to be 2 weeks after people on Patreon would see it. Anyway, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.